Ever wondered what life was like for the 90% of the Viking population we rarely hear about? Beyond the sagas of fearsome warriors and long ship voyages, there was a massive, silent workforce that powered the Viking Age. They were the thralls, the slaves of the Norse world. Their story isn't one of glory, but it's one of resilience, survival, and a fundamental part of what made the Viking society tick. Let us pull back the curtain and explore the harsh reality of life. At the bottom of the Viking social ladder. So, what exactly was a thrall? The simplest answer is a slave. In Old Norse, the word is ryle. These individuals were the lowest class in a rigid three-tiered society, beneath the carls, or free farmers, and the jarls. The aristocracy, they were considered property, chattels, just like livestock or a piece of furniture. You could be bought, sold, traded, or inherited. You had virtually no rights, and your life was entirely at the mercy of your owner. How did someone end up in this grim situation? There were three main paths into thraldom. The most infamous, of course, was through raiding. When Vikings sailed to foreign shores, it wasn't just gold and silver they were after. People were a valuable commodity. Men, women, and children, captured in raids across Europe. From the British Isles to the Slavic lands, were bound and brought back to Scandinavia to be sold in slave markets. These markets were bustling, grim hubs of human trafficking. Imagine being snatched from your home, torn from your family, and forced onto a ship, not knowing where you were going or what fate awaited you. This was the reality for countless thousands. Another path was through debt. The Viking world, for all its raiding, was also a complex economy. A free farmer, a carl, could fall on hard times, a bad harvest, a failed trading venture, or just sheer bad luck could lead to crippling debt. If you couldn't pay what you owed, you could be forced to sell yourself or your family members into thraldom to settle the score. It was a desperate last resort, a catastrophic fall from freedom to servitude. Finally, the most tragic path of all was simply being born. If your mother was a thrall, you were born a thrall. Your status was inherited, your fate sealed from your first breath. Your owner owned you from birth, and you would be raised to serve, knowing no other life. This created a self-perpetuating system of hereditary slavery that ensured a constant supply of labor for generations. So what did a day in the life of a thrall actually look like? Forget any romantic notions. It was a life of grueling, relentless, hard labor. Thralls were given the worst, most physically demanding, and most unpleasant jobs on the farmstead or in the household. If you were a male thrall, your days might be spent clearing forests, digging ditches, quarrying stone, or plowing fields with a heavy ard plow, often yoked alongside an ox. You'd be tending the animals, mucking out the longhouse, and doing all the back-breaking work that kept the farm running. You were the first to rise and the last to rest. Female thralls had their own set of exhausting tasks. They were responsible for grinding grain into flour for hours on end using heavy quernstones, a task that was notoriously hard on the back and hands. They would be milking cows, making butter and cheese, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, and of course all the cooking and cleaning for the entire household. In larger, wealthier households, female thralls were also expected to serve the family and their guests, fetching food and drink and attending to their every need. And they faced the constant threat of abuse from their owners. As for provisions, thralls received the bare minimum needed to keep them alive and working. Their food was simple and monotonous, likely consisting of porridge, coarse bread, and perhaps some fish or buttermilk. They ate the scraps and leftovers, whatever the free members of the household didn't want. Their clothing was just as basic. A simple, undyed tunic, made of rough wool or linen. It was functional, meant to offer some protection from the harsh Scandinavian weather, but nothing more. Shelter was equally stark. Thralls often didn't sleep in the main longhouse with the family. They might be relegated to a separate, smaller hut, a drafty outbuilding, or even a designated space in the barn alongside the animals. Their living conditions were cramped, uncomfortable, and offered little privacy or comfort after a long day of toil. They were constantly reminded of their lowly status, physically separated from the world of the free. While the primary roles were agricultural and domestic, some thralls did possess special skills that set them apart. If a thrall was a skilled carpenter, blacksmith, or shipbuilder before being captured, their owner would be foolish not to exploit that talent. A skilled thrall was incredibly valuable. They might work in the forge, repair tools and weapons, or help construct the very longships that brought more captives to their shores. While this might grant them slightly better treatment, it didn't change their fundamental status. They were still property, their skills belonging to their master. The social status and treatment of thralls were, as you can imagine, abysmal. Legally, they were things, not people. They couldn't own property, they couldn't testify in legal proceedings, and they couldn't marry without their owner's permission. If someone killed another person's thrall, the penalty was not a murder charge. It was a fine paid to the owner for the loss of property, the same way you'd be compensated if someone killed your prize bull. The relationship between owner and thrall was one of absolute power. Owners had the right to punish their thralls however they saw fit. While historical sources like the sagas are filled with tales of cruelty, it's also important to remember the economic reality. A thrall was a significant investment. An owner had paid good money for them or was relying on their labor to survive. Therefore, it was in the owner's best interest to keep their thralls healthy enough to work. This didn't stem from kindness, but from pragmatism. You don't destroy your own valuable tools. Still, the threat of violence and abuse was a constant, terrifying part of a thrall's existence. Was there any escape? Was freedom ever a possibility? The answer is yes, but it was a narrow and difficult path. The most common way a thrall could gain freedom was to be manumitted by their owner. This could happen for a few reasons. An owner might free a loyal thrall in their will as a final act of goodwill. Sometimes, a thrall who had shown exceptional service, perhaps by saving their owner's life in a moment of crisis, might be rewarded with their freedom. Another, more proactive way, was to essentially buy their own freedom. A thrall might be allowed to work for themselves in their spare time, if they had any, or sell small crafts they made. Over many years, it was theoretically possible to save up enough silver to pay their owner the price of their own manumission. This was incredibly rare and would have required immense determination and the cooperation of a reasonably lenient owner. But gaining freedom, a process called lazing, wasn't the end of the story. Life as a freedman, or lelendinger, came with its own set of immense challenges. You were no longer a slave, but you weren't fully free either. Freedmen occupied a precarious middle ground. They were often still bound by obligations to their former master, required to perform certain duties or pay a portion of their earnings. Social integration was a huge hurdle. They carried the stigma of their former status. They didn't have the family networks or community connections that freeborn people took for granted. Finding a place in society, securing land, and building a new life from scratch without a support system would have been incredibly difficult. Many likely remained dependent on their former owners, living a life that was only a small step up from slavery. Despite the hardships, the legacy of the thralls is undeniable. They were the engine of the Viking economy. Their labor built the farms, tended the livestock, produced the textiles, and freed up the carls and jarls to engage in the raiding, trading, and politics that defined the age. Without the thralls, the Viking world as we know it simply could not have existed. Their story is a sobering reminder that behind the grand tales of kings and warriors, there are always countless forgotten individuals whose sweat and toil make it all possible. Their voices may have been silenced in their own time, but by studying their lives, we gain a more complete picture of this fascinating and complex period of history. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the world of Viking thralls. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments what you think, or what other aspects of the Viking Age you'd like to explore. Until next time.